Um, I'm I'm going to rattle through some of this. It's quite complicated, but hopefully give you an idea of rewilding and how it really can make a difference to effectively stopping the problems of climate change. And at the end, I'm going to give you the magic way we could save the world and have lots of economic prosperity and rewilding and have all these things implemented, which sounds like a pipe dream, but hey ho. So let me crack on. So we live in a fragile ecosystem. Our we are facing an ecological collapse. The interconnectedness of systems. Spatially, we are taking wildlife away from each other. You know, little butterflies and insects and animals can't move around. We've got trophic interconnectedness being destroyed. What do I mean by that? I mean the very mycorrhizal fungi, the very microbes in the soil, how they interact with trees, how they then form soils, how all the bugs and beasties, and then going up the various trophic levels, are being pulled apart. And temporal, in time, we are taking things away, so more likely to have species die out. This results in rapid biodiversity loss. And what's becoming more important is bioabundance, the actual amount of wildlife, the numbers of things. There are some winners. We've got some great success stories. Think of grey seals. They're doing really well, especially around the south coast. Pine martens and red squirrels coming back in profusions up in Northumberland, North Wales. There's a few real good, especially when we stop persecuting. When we stopped persecuting grey seals, when we stopped persecuting pine martens, the red squirrels come back. When we stop persecuting raptors, we've got all those lovely buzzards and red kites coming back. So there is success stories, but overall, it's not a good thing. So a collapse in carbon. Essentially, we are losing carbon from our soils all over the world and in the UK. So we're reduced our ability to store carbon and our ability to suck it out of the air, sequestrate it. And we're facing the problems of climate change. Temperatures are going up, rainfall patterns are changing. We've got a lot of flooding. There's instability in the system. We also have to look at resource depletion. We've got declining fertile land and soils around the world and in the UK. We've got water scarcities, which is becoming a bigger issue in the southeast, and we've got energy shortages. And if you think that's stopping, oh no, it's getting far, far worse if you look at the basic statistics, especially with AI. AI's real scary thing is not, Terminators with their laser guns. It's the fact that they're competing for resources, especially electricity. And that's going to push up the cost and take away the very things we need to live. So we're having a resource use explosion at the moment. We aren't cutting down. Although we've managed to stabilize carbon use in the UK, that's only because we've exported it to China and India and other countries. Yeah, it's a bit of a fake that we're actually really cutting down carbon use in the UK. Bit of a dodge. So that's one of the things we need to look for. So we've got a fragile system. Oh, I didn't press the right button. Hold on. That's what's going on at the moment. So we've got ecosystem service decline. What do we mean by that? Storage, carbon storage, our ability to absorb pollutants, both in water and in the air. We've got also, if you think about ecosystem services, pest and disease control, zoonotic diseases are rising across the world. There's a lot more issues going on where losing nature is causing people problems. And the biggest one is flood prevention, probably the biggest one I've been involved in. And around the world, flooding is increasing. So our ability of our habitat to absorb water and then even release it. So we've got the bigger problem. We've got bigger floods when it rains, and when it doesn't rain, we've got more drought because the water isn't held and then released slowly. So let's have a look at natural resource use across the globe. It's going up and up and up with no stop. And even all of the electric cars and wind turbines, it's not making much of a difference. It's still going up. If we look at the science behind how wildlife is declining, there's various things globally and biodiversity matrices. The Living Planet Index is showing the rate of loss has slowed a little bit, but we're still going down, down, down. Looking at the UK, there's been some great studies on species abundance. That means the number of species. And overall, it is still dropping. The amount of wild animals is dropping. Insects, birds. Birds are a big problem. If we look at... Could somebody put themselves on mute? Thank you. If we look at things like triple SIs, the number of triple SIs in favourable condition has been reducing. So our policies aren't working. And the Natural England, bless their cotton socks, made a fantastic fudge with what they called the unfavorable recovering. So that's the turquoise bars, where basically they said they didn't look at the ecological condition. They just said if there was a management agreement or a grant being given, it was in a recovering position, right? Which it wasn't. So that they fudged the stats, and you've got problems where even our so-called best places for nature are reducing in quality. So what is rewilding? Rewilding is really about restoring ecosystems to the point where they can look after themselves. Rewilding really means we don't need any conservationists anymore because, nature looks after itself. That's pretty hard to do, but it is a goal. So core areas, large protected areas for nature, connectivity, linking fragmented habitats, using keystone species. So that's where my career has been coming in because with the wonderful John McAllister, when I worked at Kent Wildlife Trust, we did the first beaver reintroduction. We started that really back in 1999. I was just a young conservationist. And also reintroducing wild herbivores and other things like that. So I went around, and one of the early projects I did was with Dave Bosnell at Breed High Woods. So Woodland Trust, getting them to think about having some more rewilding within their management practices and their woodlands. And I did that for many wildlife trusts, other things like that. So natural processes. So rewilding is not just about, introducing a beaver or whatever. It's about natural processes. We'll all remember when the storm came, the great storm, all those trees were knocked down. Everybody said, oh God, all these poor trees. And yet all the studies show that storm actually created more biodiversity, natural destruction, having nutrient cycles from animals, doing things in the woods. Those nutrients make a huge difference. And finally, we've got to think that rewilding is about engaging people. Rewilding doesn't mean people can't live in the countryside. It just means that some of the countryside is wild and people can still enjoy it. So the thing to think about rewilding is we stop thinking about conservation, where we're conserving what has been left, and start thinking about actively restoring nature. Let's have a look at what it looks like in a woodland. A woodland should have 30% growing, 30% living, 30% dying. Lots more deadwood content, lots more complexity in how animals interact with the woodland, many more species. Look at places like the Białowieża in Poland and Belarus. Look what happened after Chernobyl went. You had huge increases in biodiversity because nature was able to take its full place in a woodland environment. Now, one of the projects I've been running is the one in the Marsham Valley near Fairlight in Sussex. The local village pet level is flooding. Lots of flooding happened really bad in 2023. So I myself started a new charity called the Future Landscapes Trust with local landowners, and we set about looking. And I actually this photo you see here is one I created in Google Earth and overlaid the watercourses. And I commented on that and sent it to all the local landowners and said, hey, we can do a really good natural flood management project. So we got a lot of money from the Environment Agency, for nearly £500,000, and lots of money from other sponsors, such as Southern Water. And we're up to about 800 grand for this project. So it costs a lot of money to do this. And we've modeled how the valley floods in extreme events. We've modeled all the rainfall events. This is a kind of graph. What you see here is the standard graph for how a place floods. You get a rainfall event here. You get a rainfall event here, and then you get a peak discharge up at the top here. And that's what causes the flood, because all of the water comes to one point, and if it's badly done, all the water from the whole catchment arrives at one point and causes the flood. We employed this fantastic team of engineers to computer modelers to model precisely what happens in the valley. So in a once in a lifetime flood event, this would happen. This big line here is the peak flow, and that would devastate the village and kill many people. If we put in the natural flood management structures and improve the habitat in the valley, it is the pink line here that it would be reduced by. The blue line here is where the 2023 flood event, that's what happened. And the dark blue line is what would have happened if we had put in our natural flood management structures. So what are they? We've got leaky dams, trying to be a beaver, just basically pretending to be a beaver. Be much better if we had beaver, but we don't. So all over the woodlands of Mallydams Wood, Hoad Wood, Stony Link Wood, we are putting in lots of these structures. Across a number of farms, we'll be putting in buffer strips, cross-plant sowing, other techniques. In our woodlands, we're going to be making more complex woodland understory, the wooded heath here. Imagine that the little raindrop has to go much further around all of that complex understory, much, much further, orders of magnitude further. The soils are more likely to be complex carbon, and the water will infiltrate into the ground quicker, forming a giant sponge, slowing the flow, creating time to spread out the flood down at pet level. Wet woodlands, they're another huge thing. Wet woodlands are a much underloved habitat. All of that sphagnum and boggy land, it creates a huge sponge. I've stood in some places where the level you're standing on changes by 30 feet between summer and winter because of the absorption of water. It's amazing what can happen and how much boggy woodland. Anyway, all put into a big computer model, and we then get told where to put all of our structures and do all the work that will maximize its effectiveness. And do we know it's going to work? Well, we've put in automatic flow and level monitors throughout the valley, and we automatically receive all the data. So as we do the works, we'll know if it's slowing the flow and if it will prevent. Look at some of the devastating flooding we've had around the country and our history. Look at the Boscastle where some people died. That was all because of changes in agriculture around there and changes in farm management. Plantation woodlands are not good, really bad for flooding, poor soil structures. We've got compacted soils, and either arable or overgrazing in the uplands, and that all means the water runs off. So one of the projects that stimulated my rewilding career was this place in the Netherlands. It's called Blauwkamer, which means blue house, and it's a popular tourist destination. Now, back in the 60s, they went and all this area you see here was turned into farmland, which was floodplain. And over time, you have winter dikes, which stop winter floods, and you had some summer dikes were put in that stopped the water flowing in during the summer. But in the winter, the water would still come in when the tributary of the Rhine, it would flood in, but like pouring sand into a bathtub, it would start filling. So its capacity to absorb water was greatly reduced. This caused the town of Rennen, which is over here, to flood. And there was an appalling incident where a school was flooded and some school children were killed. And that forced the hand. So they decided to abandon the farming in this area to take away some of the sediment that used to build polders out at sea and rewild it. And that's one of the first rewilding projects in Europe. And they used these conic ponies to do that, which stimulated me to emulate that and bring these conic ponies first to Stodmarsh and then to other places around the country. And they are fantastic, hardy wild ponies that do really well in wetlands. And they make the wetlands create those soil structures and the complex vegetation that absorbs the water. Right, next little story. 20 tons of Hypex to save London. Now, this is what we call coastal realignment, but it's just a little silly way. Apparently, Hypex is the most environmentally friendly explosive. I used to call it 20 tons of gelignite to save London, but now it's Hypex. So storm surges come up the estuary, low pressures and high tides push the water up the estuary, and it could flood London. You've also got the problem that you've got more water coming from the Cotswold Plain, the plateau, and other areas because of agricultural drainage improvements. So the water comes faster down to Teddington at the west side of London, and you've got the channel coming in here. So the Thames estuary rises. Now, in the past, a lot of this area was salt marsh. And when we had flood events, such as the one in the 50s, a lot of these areas used to flood. You can map out where the salt marsh would flood and take the water. Now, of course, we've put sea defences across all of there. So when the Thames rises, the Thames estuary, and you get a storm surge, the water's got nowhere to go but further up towards London. And that means it's going to flood. But if we blew those flood defences, we would bend up with salt marsh again. That would be a good idea, wouldn't it? And if you do all the calculations, the land behind some of these seawalls is no good for agriculture because it's often brackish, it's got salt in it, it's poor quality, and we're spending a fortune to protect land that we don't need for food and is really economically wasteful. So we can rewild our coasts and save us from some flooding. Right, next example. This is the Blean Woods around Canterbury. It was planted up with Corsican pine and western hemlock as a fast-growing species. It was done as a tax dodge. Back in the 70s and 80s, it was a capital gains tax dodge. There's numerous tax dodges you can have with woodland, inappropriate woodland. So they wanted a fast-growing species, but it wasn't. These trees aren't very good for timber production, so it was really done as a way of tax dodging for ultra-rich people, not as commercial forestry, and that meant it wasn't managed, so it then filled up with rhododendron, and it was a huge problem. You've got 1,200 acres of rhododendron infested woodland with poor quality biodiversity. So when I was at Kent Wildlife Trust, again, me and John Mack, we decided to try and buy this. It cost 5 million quid, a lot of money. And that price is going up all the time. We'll talk about that in a little while. And when we obviously ground up all of this, we introduced some of our conics again. And to help diversify the regrowth and to create complex habitats without having to spend too much time to it. And over that time, one of my passions was to reintroduce bison, European bison. And it took nearly 20 years of effort, but that finally happened about 5 years ago. And they are again creating that cyclic destruction and complexity within the woodland. Okay, my next one, we're going to talk about carbon, right? The very born from the heart of stars, exploded into the universe through supernova. Carbon is the very essence of life, but there is good carbon and there's bad carbon. When carbon's complex and held within life and the biomass, within soils, deep in the oceans, it's good. But if it's released into the atmosphere as simple carbon dioxide, it becomes very bad. So, how do we understand carbon? Well, the seas have the most carbon in the deep ocean, but that doesn't react with the atmosphere. It's only the surface ocean. So about 1,000 gigatons of carbon react in our biosphere. The biggest source of carbon is about 2,300 gigatons in the soil. And the trouble is, although we've got all these other processes in the carbon cycle, over the last, well, increasingly over the last few hundred years, we've been treating our soils very, very poorly. There's very little carbon left in many soils. And that is a huge source of atmospheric carbon. Now, various modelers do it in different ways, but basically, you can model carbon, and a lot of it, at least 15%, some believe 50% of all the atmospheric carbon is from oxidizing soils. And that is a huge problem. We're draining soils all over the world. We don't understand the science of soil is not well understood. It's certainly not incorporated into the carbon calculations we're using at the moment in all of our carbon schemes, because we only include the first 10 or 20 centimeters of the soil when there's a lot more carbon beneath it. But let's have a look at a little example. So, how much carbon is in our land? If we look at arable land, about 1.4 tons of carbon per hectare. Woodland, plantation woodland, 85 tons per carbon. People think woods have got loads of carbon in. It's because most of the carbon's in the soil. It's not in the trees, not in the leaves. Ancient woodland's a bit better. If you go to some woodlands around the world, you can have up to 130 tons, but most of the ancient woodland, about that. Complex, good quality heathland can actually have a little bit more. Dwarf scrub, that's the rewilded habitat. That's what you've got at Knepp and other places like that. That's 210, 211 tons of carbon per hectare. Some very complex grasslands, ancient grasslands, savanna, you can have even more in hugely complex soils, 430. Wetlands, your ponds and lakes, they can store carbon really well at the bottom of their lake beds, 500 tons. Wet woodland, really good. That's the one to go for. That's what we should all be looking for. Wet woodlands, we can get 625 tons. But let's have a look. There's another type of habitat we haven't discussed, and that's peatlands. And of course, peatlands can have trees on them. A lot of people think peatlands don't have trees, but that's not true. There's vast peatlands with trees on them in tropical climates as well as used to be in the UK, but mostly they've been drained. And most of that drainage has been done by foresters of the past or farmers. And that can have 5,000 tons of carbon per hectare. So when we're looking at carbon storage, rewilding, the right type of habitats, the really natural habitats, have an immense ability to store carbon. I've done some calculations that showed that if we reintroduce beavers, and of course beavers are the chief architect of these habitats, and we had them on 30% of our waterways in the UK, that would sequestrate about the same amount of carbon that we produce as humans in the UK. It is truly a colossal amount. So what's stopping us rewilding? Land. Simple as that. We can't access land. And when we try to buy it, it costs a fortune. And since I started as a young conservationist, land prices have gone up by 40 times. So every time we get a bit more money or invest a bit more money, the land value goes up even more. So we're not buying any more, which is madness. So a lot of my time has been understanding the land market and land economics. Why is land costing so much and absorbing all the money in society? So some of you will know that in house prices, because houses don't go up in value, just the land beneath them go up in value. Not unless you build a much nicer house. So the cost of land, bureaucracy and ill-conceived policy. In my time, I've seen too many projects just become bureaucratic and not actually make any changes on the ground. And we've got a lot of ill-conceived policies that don't actually work in helping rewilding happen. So rewilding is just happening on land that is owned by a few people who are motivated, have the wealth, or they are conservationists. But mostly the very reverse of rewilding is happening, where we're intensifying land use. We also have to fear economic loss. Policymakers are fearful of people losing their jobs and the revenue of public services of investing in policies that will rewild and retain the ecosystem services we have. My economist friends always talk about perverse incentives and futile trade-offs. How can we change the incentives for people to do good and for us to understand that having nature does not rob us of jobs, a futile trade-off? Because it is futile. Because if we lose nature, we will lose our economy and it'll cost us so much more in the future. So, and the other thing that I think stopping rewilding happening, certainly in my time, is politics. The politicians and civil service have incredibly narrow policy options. So their options basically, you can have policy A that doesn't save wildlife and doesn't allow proper rewilding, or you can have policy B that doesn't allow rewilding and doesn't do anything. So policies that we have aren't working. Subsidies, agricultural and agri-environment schemes are often captured by landowners because the rents go up and the price of the land goes up. If you give a subsidy, guess what? You just increase the rent. So the actual farmer's no better off if he's a tenant farmer. And this is well proven in economics. Grants, again, often captured by landowners, and they're not that effective. There's a lot, when you give grants to people, often they are not that effective. People aren't actually that good at looking after things. Nature's better. So we've also got things like carbon trading. And for one of my sins, I designed the carbon trading of Saudi Arabia, one of my previous consulting jobs, their system. And we've also got biodiversity net gain. Now, carbon trading isn't working. All of the statistical analysis shows it doesn't work. We are not stopping carbon being produced by having a carbon trading systems, carbon credits or whatever. All we're doing is enriching the people who are speculating on the value of those carbon credits. It's not really changing things on the ground. Biodiversity net gains coming on. So here's an example. A few weeks ago, a wonderful guy called Andy Whiteman did an excellent analysis where he showed some poor quality land in Scotland had gone up to a price of £14,000 a hectare because we've got people, international finance is buying up all this land and then they're just doing a net present value. This is what the government says they're going to pay, and they're planting trees and they're capturing all of that money that is coming from carbon trading schemes just into the land values. And remember, planting trees, bad idea. It doesn't sequester carbon, because often in that land, the carbon in the soil is much larger. So in the first 20 years of that tree growing, it's actually oxidizing carbon into the air from the ground, and it's not actually sequestering it. So the calculations are wrong, and that's going on all over the world. Tree planting is a stupid idea. Trees, believe it or not, I'll let you into a secret, right? I've been an ecologist for 35 years, and trees actually grow themselves. You don't need to plant them. Just a little thing there. So policies not working at actually providing real things that will prevent climate change. So let's have a look at some policies that do work. When we had a plastic bag tax, you had a 98% reduction in single-use plastic bags, virtually overnight. When we had a landfill tax, that was back in the 90s, we had a 90% reduction in mixed municipal waste. It isn't the best way to tax things at the end of use. I mean, you're far better off at taxing the resources that go into creating rubbish. That would be even more effective, but it still worked. Sugar tax, substantially reduced childhood sugar intake. Interesting, that. How about a water abstraction license? So when I worked in Cape Town with some really interesting water engineers and economists, they introduced a water abstraction license that saw a 50% drop in water consumption. And that meant that people could survive. It didn't impoverish people because there was support for poor people from the amount taxed on that water abstraction, but it forced everybody. When you have taxes like this, it means that the entrepreneurial drive in people is now motivated to use less of it. Now, imagine if we could transfer that same economic theorem into how we treat land, ecosystem services, and nature. So, how do we bring policies that really work for rewilding? Create a true green economy that can reduce poverty, it can increase wages, increase everybody's prosperity. Not everybody. It won't increase the prosperity of people who have their money just by owning land and not working on it. And it won't increase the prosperity of people who make money from pollution and depleting our natural resources. So we can rebalance the incentives for land use by having a tax, taxing land, the land value tax as it used to be known. It's been known by economists from the very start. Every major economist that you can think of, Adam Smith, John Mills, David Ricardo, all the modern tax, even from Karl Marx to Adam Smith, left or right, doesn't matter. They all say taxing land and not wages, because it's a monopoly, will create prosperity and a far more efficient economy. When it comes to carbon use, we need to tax carbon at source when it enters into the human use as it's extracted, And for poor people, they can get given a bit of money so that they're not in energy or land poverty because they don't have access to it. Taxing land removes the private tax on nature and rewilding because it costs getting access to land is so incredibly expensive, and therefore conservation can't afford it. If we tax land, land values will plummet like a stone, absolutely plummet, and we will be able to get a hold of land to rewild and create all those ecosystem services. But taxing land, as many economists will inform you, got to do a bit of research because it's complex stuff. It removes a poverty trap because when we tax land, we don't have to tax wages. We don't have to tax when we tax carbon. We can tax that instead of having a VAT. So those taxes are reduced. That stimulates economic activity, and it's a much fairer system. The poor are less affected, and they will actually have higher jobs, higher wages, better lives, more efficient economy. And it'll be a greener economy because remember, every economic system, every economic decision you make has to be done where you see if I use that thing that uses carbon or natural resources or minerals, that's gonna cost me more. If I use less, it's going to cost me less. If I do something that's going to require more land, that's going to cost more. So therefore, I'm going to make the decision that uses less land and less natural resources. So everybody instantly becomes a capitalist for saving the world. So there we go. There's my talk.